Hi everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this class. This is the last video that I'll be recording, and instead of talking about a specific novel or a specific text, it attempts to draw some larger conclusions about some of the things that we've read and asks you to maybe draw some of your own conclusions about the things we've read and how they connect to our own experiences today. So, as we've talked about, in Austen's time, there were a lot of written and unwritten rules that governed all aspects of people's life. A person's gender and their rank, so their class status, determined everything from the kind of education they received, to the employment options available to them, to the people they were expected to marry, to even the type of clothing they were expected to wear and the food they were expected to eat. So there were rules that governed basically every aspect of their life. And while a few of these rules may have been written down and codified, a lot of them weren't. They were just general expectations that people had about how people should behave. And those rules were enforced by people basically not talking to people who disobeyed the rules or socially ostracizing people who disobeyed those rules. So some of the examples that we've talked about in this class and were rules that specifically were for the landed gentry, so gentlemen and ladies who lived at sort of the top of the class system in Austen's time. So for example, we've talked about how gentlemen, so men of this sort of class status, weren't expected to work for a living, with the exception of becoming a clergyman or an officer in the military. If they took a job, or they went into a different kind of profession, they sort of automatically lost class status. We've also talked about how ladies had very few employment opportunities. If women weren't able to marry and didn't have a husband or a brother or a father who could financially provide for them, then their only option was to become a governess. That was really the only sort of work that was open for them. We've also talked about how sort of ladies' education was focused on superficial accomplishments. Things like dancing, music, the piano, maybe some languages like French or Italian. But they didn't really have any education in anything that was sort of practical, and they certainly didn't have education in things that men had education in. So men's education during this time involved classical languages like Latin and Greek, as well as other sort of more sort of rigorous subjects, and women didn't have that kind of education. We've also talked about how women's social value, specifically in the upper classes, were tied to their perceived sexual purity. So women who showed too much interest in men were shamed sort of publicly as too forward or as flirts. And women who had sexual contact outside of marriage were socially ostracized. They basically were sort of sent to live in the country and no one ever saw them, and they never had any sort of contact with anybody else again. And also, as we've talked about, women and men who were in this upper class were expected to marry someone within the same social class. So gentlemen were expected to marry ladies, and ladies were expected to marry gentlemen. And also, this isn't something we've explicitly talked about, but as part of this as well, it was obviously expected that men would marry women and women would marry men. So there was this very sort of, there's an expectation that you would be interested in and marry someone of the opposite gender and have children with those people. So this week, in discussion, one of the things I want you to begin thinking about is, are there similar expectations that govern how we behave in our own culture? And obviously our culture is very different from Austen's culture, and obviously women in our culture have sort of more freedoms than they did in Austen's culture, and in some ways men have more freedoms too. There are things that men couldn't do during Austen's time that men can do now, and also there's certainly more opportunities for people who, are gay or lesbian or otherwise queer to engage in different kinds of romantic relationships outside of sort of traditional heterosexual marriage. But with that aside, I think there are still some ways in which our lives are governed by these sort of unwritten rules. And there are even some parallels between those rules and the rules that were around in Austen's time, even if they're not exactly the same. So some of some things or some sort of ways to start thinking about this are these questions that I've given you. And you don't have to think about every one of these questions, and you're not limited to these questions, but these are just some starting points to start thinking about these kinds of things. So the first question I present is how are men and women expected to present themselves in our culture? So, how are they supposed to dress? How are they supposed to behave? How are they supposed to talk? How are they supposed to do their hair? What kinds of clothes are they supposed to wear? And then how do we respond to people who break social roles? So how do we respond when we come across a woman who doesn't shave her legs or her armpits, for example? What happens to those people? Another question is what kinds of activities are girls and women expected to behave in, and what kind of activities are boys and men expected to behave in? Are there any parallels between the activities that girls and boys are expected to participate in now and the different activities that men and women engaged in during Austen's time? So, for example, in Austen's time, women were taught how to sew and how to dance and how to play music. And that was sort of the things that they were expected to sort of do when they were home. And men were taught how to hunt. And that was sort of the pastime or the sort of hobby that sort of most men engaged in. So are there any similarities between those in our own time? And if so, what are those? And then other things we've talked about have to do with sort of the way that both women and to a certain extent men are expected to behave sexually. So how are men expected to behave sexually in our culture? And how are women expected to behave sexually? Is it considered bad for men or women to have a lot of sexual partners? Why, if so? And are there any parallels to the expectations for men's and women's sexual behavior in Austen's time? And if so, what are these parallels? What sort of similarities do you notice? There's obviously differences too, but I want you to also attend to the similarities as well as the differences. And related to that, are women or men who have a lot of sexual partners shamed or punished in some way in our own culture? And if so, how? And do you notice any parallels between our culture and Austen's culture in that respect? And then finally, I want you to think about sort of our expectations around romantic relationships. So what expectations do we have about romantic relationships? For example, do we assume that men will date women and that women will date men? So do we assume that people will date someone or marry someone of a sort of different gender than them? And are there any other sort of expectations we have around the way that romantic relationships and marriage operate? And then related to that, how is dating and marriage depicted in our own sort of contemporary novels and films and TV shows? And what do these narratives possibly reveal about our expectations regarding relationships? So these are just some questions to get you started. And let me just say as a caveat, I'm not asking you to make any sort of judgments about people's behaviors or even our expectations. I'm not trying to say that necessarily all the expectations we have for people are even always a bad thing. But I just want us to sort of think about what are the unwritten rules that govern our own behavior. And when it makes sense, are there any parallels between those unwritten rules and the rules that govern people's behavior during Austen's time? So I look forward to seeing what you think in discussion, and I hope you have a good rest of the semester.